The chair scraped behind me as the bailiff called order, and every head turned slowly. I stayed seated as the defendant stood because standing felt more dangerous today. My hands locked together while the courtroom breathed, and my name waited somewhere unseen. I listened to her testimony begin as my pulse climbed and the truth stayed perfectly still. The judge cleared his throat while I realized safety had nothing to do with innocence. I stayed behind him because being visible had already cost me everything once. The courtroom felt like a sealed room underwater, where every movement slowed and every sound carried farther than it should, and I learned quickly that stillness was the only way to survive breathing there. People think courtrooms are loud places, full of objections and raised voices, but the real weight lives in the pauses, in the moments where nothing is said and everyone pretends not to notice. This was not my first time sitting in silence. I was 43 years old when I learned where to place my body so my face wouldn't betray me, and that lesson came long before any judge ever looked down from a bench. I sat behind the defendant because it was the only angle where she couldn't read me, because from there her peripheral vision failed and mine finally worked. The case was framed as a business dispute, clean on paper, polite in language, something about harassment claims and financial misrepresentation that sounded technical enough to stay impersonal. But I knew better because I had lived inside the kind of control that never leaves fingerprints, the kind that rewrites memory instead of breaking bones. She sat 2 rows ahead, shoulders squared, hair precise, hands folded like restraint itself, and I noticed immediately how relaxed she looked being watched. Some people shrink under attention, while others straighten, and she had always been the kind who grew taller when witnesses gathered. Julian, the defendant, kept his eyes down as if gravity itself felt heavier near the floor, and I understood that posture too, because it's what happens when you're already rehearsing how not to be believed. He wasn't innocent in the simple way people hope for, but innocence was never the currency she traded in any way. I was called a peripheral witness, which sounded harmless until I realized it meant disposable, someone useful enough to summon but small enough to dismiss. That role fit me perfectly, because I had spent years being useful in ways that erased me slowly, professionally, politely, with documentation. When the clerk called my name earlier that morning, her voice echoed longer than necessary, and I felt that old instinct rise, the one that tells you to disappear before someone decides who you are for you. So, I chose the seat that let me vanish from her sight line because survival sometimes looks like geometry, not courage. She didn't look back when I sat down, and that absence of reaction told me more than confrontation ever could, because she trusted the room to keep behaving for her. People like her always do, because systems reward confidence far more than truth, and courtrooms are systems built on performance dressed as procedure. As opening statements began, I watched her nod at the right moments, tilt her head when sympathy was required, and remain perfectly still when facts brushed too close. Her control wasn't loud. It was rhythmic, practiced, and terrifyingly familiar, like a song I had learned to hum without realizing who taught me. Julian shifted once, just once, and she noticed because predators always notice movement, even when pretending not to look. That was when I understood fully why I couldn't sit anywhere else, because behind him was the only place where I could observe without being managed. I didn't come to speak that day, not yet, and I didn't come to accuse or defend anyone openly. I came to watch the pattern finish forming, because patterns only reveal themselves when you stop interrupting them. I thought discovery would arrive like a document or a confession, but instead it came as a physical sensation, a tightening in my chest as patterns aligned quietly while everyone else chased facts. The courtroom kept moving forward, testimony stacking neatly, and yet something underneath it all began pulling backward through my memory with uncomfortable precision. I listened to her describe timelines as if they were neutral, while I noticed how carefully she avoided exact dates, choosing seasons and quarters instead, because vagueness had always been her preferred shelter. That was when I realized she wasn't forgetting anything at all. She was editing, and editing is never accidental when practiced long enough. I had seen this before. Years earlier, when I worked under her, she taught me how to summarize meetings so efficiently that uncomfortable moments simply disappeared, and I learned that omission could feel like professionalism if presented calmly enough. Sitting there now, I heard the same cadence in her testimony, the same soft glide over details that once cost me months of self-doubt and sleepless nights. The lawyer asked about email correspondence, and she answered smoothly, while I noticed her right hand press briefly against her left wrist, a gesture so small it felt invisible, but it was the same one she used whenever control felt momentarily threatened. I remembered that hand on my shoulder once, not heavy, not aggressive, just present enough to remind me who decided what counted as misunderstanding. Documents appeared on the screen, enlarged and sterile, and the room leaned forward slightly as if truth had finally arrived in readable form. But I leaned back because I wasn't reading the documents, I was listening to what wasn't being explained around them. One email stood out, not because of its content, but because of its tone, deferential and apologetic in a way that sounded painfully familiar to me. It was written in my voice, careful and accommodating, structured to absorb responsibility without assigning it, and my stomach dropped as recognition settled. The timestamp placed it during a period when I was officially on medical leave, signed out, unreachable, and barely functioning enough to answer my phone, let alone draft workplace correspondence. No one else in the room reacted because to them it was just another line of evidence, but to me it felt like someone reading my handwriting aloud years after stealing my pen. I had not sent that email. The realization didn't explode, it compressed, folding inward as memory after memory adjusted its shape to fit this new truth. Conversations I once blamed myself for, misunderstandings I carried like personal failures, suddenly rearranged into something colder and far more deliberate. I remembered asking her once if she needed approval before sending something in my name, and how she smiled gently while saying it was only to keep things moving efficiently. At the time, I mistook efficiency for trust, because I wanted to believe collaboration didn't require constant vigilance. As the trial continued, more emails surfaced, and with each one, I recognized phrasing patterns, emotional cushioning techniques, and the strategic placement of uncertainty where accountability should have lived. She wasn't just managing people, she was managing narratives, and she had done it so quietly that even I accepted authorship of things I never chose. The lawyer moved on, satisfied, and the judge nodded as if the matter was settled, while I sat there feeling something heavier than anger begin to form. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't fear either, but a slow clarity that arrived only after enough time had passed to make denial inconvenient. This was not about the defendant anymore. Julian shifted again, and for the first time, our eyes met briefly, not in alliance, not in trust, but in shared recognition of the machine we were both caught inside. He didn't know my history, and I didn't need him to, because this discovery wasn't something that required witnesses to be real. By the end of the day, I understood something crucial, something that changed the way I held my body in that seat behind him. I wasn't there to protect myself from being seen anymore. I was there because I finally understood where the leverage lived, and it wasn't in confrontation. The truth had already surfaced, quietly, internally, and once that happens, silence stops being weakness and starts becoming a strategy. Once I recognized the pattern, I stopped leaning forward during testimony because attention feeds performers, and starvation was the only response that ever weakened her grip. I let my body relax into the chair while my mind stayed alert, tracking rhythm instead of words, because truth often leaks through timing long before it admits itself. Silence isn't passive when it's chosen deliberately, and I chose it with the same care she once chose her phrasing. That decision alone changed the temperature of the room for me. Waiting became a position, not a pause. Each day, I arrived early and left late, not to be seen as committed, but to watch who lingered when they thought the story was finished. I noticed which lawyers spoke quietly near the exits, which witnesses avoided eye contact afterward, and which documents were carried separately instead of stacked. Her confidence remained intact on the stand, but off it, I began to notice the smallest fractures, moments where her certainty needed reinforcement from others. She checked her phone more often, stepped into hallways to take calls, and returned with that same composed face that never quite reached her eyes. During a break, I overheard a conversation about shared assets, something about accounts frozen temporarily, framed as inconvenience rather than concern. That was when I remembered the way finances were always discussed in my own marriage, indirectly, as if clarity itself might provoke instability. I had learned long ago that money doesn't argue, it just shifts quietly, and whoever notices first usually decides who survives the shift. Sitting there, I began connecting her testimony not just to workplace control, but to the private economies people build inside relationships. At home, years earlier, my husband Mark used to say he trusted me completely right before asking me not to question numbers he had already finalized. Listening now, I heard the same logic echoed in court, that trust meant compliance, and silence meant agreement. I had been trained for this moment, without knowing it. The defendant's counsel began emphasizing intent, while the plaintiff's side leaned heavily on perception, and I watched her adjust accordingly, softening here, sharpening there, always one step ahead. But something had shifted because she was no longer dictating the entire rhythm, only responding to it. I stayed silent when I was tempted to clarify, because I understood that premature truth often collapses under its own weight. Instead, I let her continue building a structure that required my erasure to remain stable. Julian glanced back once more, and this time I didn't look away, because I no longer needed to hide behind him to feel protected. The safety had moved inward, settling into certainty rather than concealment. By the fourth day, the financial records surfaced more frequently, subtle references to transfers explained away as administrative, necessary, routine. No one called them theft, and no one needed to, because the language of necessity does more damage when left unchallenged. I noticed how she never denied control, only reframed it as responsibility, and that distinction mattered deeply to me now. Responsibility can be shared, but control always wants a single author. This was the moment to let her finish speaking. I understood then that my role wasn't to interrupt the narrative, but to let it reach the point where its own weight bent it out of shape. Strategic silence isn't about patience alone. It's about trusting that patterns reveal themselves when given enough uninterrupted space. As I waited, I felt the strange calm that comes when fear exhausts itself, and all that remains is clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to someone else's version of events. I was preparing to place mine gently, precisely, where it could not be ignored. Pressure doesn't arrive loudly. It accumulates the way water does behind a wall, and I felt it building as testimony began circling the same facts with increasing impatience. The lawyers repeated questions with slightly altered phrasing, and each repetition tightened the room, because everyone sensed the story was stalling without knowing why. Her answers remained controlled, but control requires energy, and I could see the cost starting to surface in the pauses she hadn't rehearsed. She drank more water, cleared her throat too often, and leaned toward her attorney during breaks, as if borrowing steadiness instead of strategy. Control always fails first in the body. The financial exhibits grew thicker, less narrative-driven, and more procedural, which should have helped her, because procedures hide intent well. Instead, they began exposing the quiet asymmetry she depended on, accounts with dual access presented as partnership, while decision authority lived firmly in one place. I watched the jurors shift, not dramatically, but subtly, the way people do when they sense something unresolved but can't yet articulate it. Confusion is dangerous in court because it invites curiosity, and curiosity is rarely kind to carefully edited stories. At home, weeks before the trial, Mark asked me why I seemed distracted, and I almost laughed at the irony of that question now. I told him I was tired because that was easier than explaining how long it takes to recognize a pattern you helped normalize. The plaintiff's attorney pressed harder, asking about approval processes, oversight, and shared responsibility, and I noticed how often she used we when describing benefits, but I when describing decisions. That linguistic shift wasn't accidental, and once noticed, it became impossible to unhear. Language always leaks intent. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway and felt my hands shaking for the first time, not from fear of exposure, but from the effort of continued restraint. Holding silence requires more discipline than speaking, especially when you finally understand exactly what you could dismantle if you chose to. Someone brushed past me, apologizing automatically, and I realized how deeply ingrained deference can be, how easily it disguises itself as politeness. That realization settled heavily, because it meant the system she thrived in wasn't built by villains, but by habits. Back inside, the judge asked a clarifying question about financial oversight, and the room leaned in again, hopeful for resolution. She answered confidently, but her explanation required 3 assumptions to be accepted without proof, and I saw one juror's brow crease slightly, as if noticing the same gap. Julian's counsel seized the moment, not aggressively but methodically, laying documents side by side without commentary. The contrast did the work, because pressure doesn't need volume when structure begins to contradict itself. This was the straining point. I felt it in my chest, that familiar pull between self-protection and responsibility, and I stayed seated, breathing through it slowly. The urge to intervene rose sharply, but I remembered every time interruption had been used against me, reframed as instability or bias. The day ended without resolution, which unsettled everyone except me, because unresolved pressure is only dangerous to those who need immediate closure. I left the courthouse knowing the silence was nearing its limit, and that when it finally broke, it would do so on terms shaped by patience, not impulse. The shift didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly during a routine question, the kind designed to confirm what everyone already assumed. Her attorney asked her to clarify authorization protocols one last time, confident the answer would land cleanly and close the loop. She began smoothly, referencing shared access and mutual understanding, and I felt the room relax prematurely, as if resolution had finally agreed to cooperate. That was when I noticed the clerk hesitate slightly before displaying the next document, just long enough for attention to sharpen. This was not an interruption. IT was an opening. The document was an internal access log, dry and technical, listing timestamps and credential usage without commentary. No one gasped, no one reacted audibly, because power flips don't need drama, they need alignment. As the attorney guided her through it, the pattern surfaced without accusation, entries clustered during periods when others were unavailable, inactive, or formally excused. Her posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, shoulders tightening as if the chair itself had become less supportive. She explained the access as procedural necessity, administrative efficiency, continuity of operations. The words sounded reasonable, but they stacked too neatly, smoothing over the absence of consent with familiarity. Then the question came, framed gently, almost respectfully, asking whether she had ever sent correspondence under another employee's name to maintain workflow. The room went still in the way it does when everyone senses a threshold. She paused too long. That pause carried weight because it wasn't confusion, it was calculation, and calculation under oath feels different when witnessed closely. She answered carefully, denying intent while avoiding specificity, and I felt something release inside my chest. Not relief, but readiness. My name was introduced not as an accusation, but as context, and I was asked to confirm a timeline I had lived through silently. I stood slowly because standing quickly would have looked like eagerness, and eagerness has always been misread. I described my medical leave, my lack of access, my absence from decision-making spaces during that period, and I spoke without emotion because emotion would have given her something to manage. The truth didn't rise, it settled, spreading calmly through the room as consistency replaced narrative. I did not accuse, I described. When shown the email again, I identified the voice, not the message, explaining how language can mirror deference without belonging to the person named. That distinction mattered because it reframed the act from collaboration to substitution. She looked at me then, directly, for the first time all week, and there was no anger in her expression, only recognition. She understood at that moment that the story no longer required my silence to hold. The judge asked a single follow-up, precise and unavoidable, about authorization boundaries. Her answer landed softer this time, less certain, because control collapses quickly once its authorship is questioned. Julian exhaled beside me, not in triumph, but in release, and I realized the power flip wasn't about him being believed. It was about her no longer being unquestioned. The room had shifted, and everyone felt it. There was no outburst, no dramatic objection, no theatrical unraveling. The exposure happened the way real accountability often does, through alignment of detail rather than force. As I sat back down, I felt no urge to watch her anymore, because observation had completed its work. The silence I carried into that courtroom had finally spoken, and it didn't need to raise its voice. The ruling didn't come with a gasp or a collective inhale. It arrived the way most real endings do, measured and procedural, carrying its weight without announcing it. I listened as findings were summarized carefully, responsibility redistributed, and credibility recalibrated without naming a villain, because the room no longer needed one. What mattered was that authorship had shifted, and once that happens, control rarely recovers its original shape. She sat still as the words landed, posture intact, expression neutral, but I recognized the difference between composure and command. Something had ended, even if nothing looked broken. Outside the courtroom, people spoke in lowered voices, already converting the experience into anecdotes and lessons they could carry without discomfort. I walked past them slowly, not because I was tired, but because I no longer felt chased by anyone else's urgency. Julian nodded once as we parted, not in gratitude, not in alliance, but in mutual acknowledgement of an outcome that didn't require celebration. We had both survived something larger than the case itself, and survival doesn't always ask for conversation. At home that evening, Mark asked how it went, and I noticed how my answer didn't need to be softened or shortened to protect anyone's interpretation. I told him it resolved, and that word felt complete enough to stand on its own. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, not because nothing had changed, but because change had already done its loudest work internally. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, no longer corrected myself before speaking, no longer wondered if clarity would cost me stability. Authority does not arrive with applause. I understood then that power isn't reclaimed in moments of confrontation, but in the slow refusal to participate in erasure ever again. That courtroom didn't give me my voice, it simply stopped taking it for granted. Sometimes I think about the seat I chose that first day, about how safety looked like hiding until it slowly turned into position. There are places where standing in front feels brave, and places where standing behind is the only way to see clearly. I didn't walk away feeling victorious, and I didn't need to, because victory implies opposition, and what I gained was autonomy. That difference matters more than people realize. Silence is not empty when it is chosen. If there's a lesson in what I lived through, it's this. Pay attention to who speaks for you when you're tired, distracted, or trying to keep the peace. Control rarely announces itself as cruelty. it often arrives dressed as efficiency, trust, or help. And maybe the harder question is one we don't ask often enough. Where have you mistaken quiet compliance for safety, and what has it quietly cost you?